The Chronicles of Narnia, The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 3 The Sailing of the King. What made Scrub look so dingy, and Jill too, if she could only have seen herself, was the splendor of their surroundings. I'd better describe them at once. There were a cleft in those mountains which Jill had seen far inland as she approached the land. The sunset light was pouring over a level lawn. On the far side of the lawn, its weather vanes glittering in the light, rose a many-towered and many-turreted castle, the most beautiful castle Jill had ever seen. On the near side was a quay of white marble, and moored to this the ship, a tall ship with high forecastle and high poop, gilded and crimson, with a great flag at the masthead, and many banners waving from the decks, and a row of shields, bright as silver, along the bulwarks. The gangplank was laid to her, and at the foot of it, just ready to go on board, stood an old man. He wore a rich mantle of scarlet, which opened in front to show his silver mail shirt. There was a thin circlet of gold on his head. His beard, white as wool, fell nearly to his waist. He stood straight enough, leaning one hand on the shoulder of a richly dressed lord who seemed younger than himself, but you could see he was very old and frail. He looked as if a puff of wind could blow him away, and his eyes were watery. Immediately in front of the king, who had turned round to speak to his people before going on board the ship, there was a little chair on wheels, and, harnessed to it, a little donkey, not much bigger than a big retriever. In this chair sat a fat little dwarf. He was richly dressed as the king, but because of his fatness, and because he was sitting hunched up among the cushions, the effect was quite different. It made him look like a shapeless little bundle of fur and silk and velvet. He was old as the king, but more hale and hearty, with very keen eyes. His bare head, which was bald and extremely large, shone like a gigantic billiard ball in the sunset light. Further back, in a half circle, stood what Joel at once knew to be the courtiers. They were well worth looking at for their clothes and armor alone. As far as that went, they looked more like a flower bed than a crowd. But what really made Jill open her eyes and mouth as wide as they would go was the people themselves, if people was the right word. For about only 1 in every 5 was human. The rest were things you could never see in our world. Fauns, satyrs, centaurs. Jill could give a name to these, for she had seen pictures of them. Dwarfs too, and there were a lot of animals she knew as well. Bears, badgers, moles, leopards, mice, and various birds. But then they were so very different from the animals which one called by the same names in England. Some of them were much bigger. Mice, for instance, stood on their hind legs and were over 2 feet high. But quite apart from that, they all looked different. You could see by the expression in their faces that they could talk and think just as well as you could. Golly, thought Jill, so it's true after all. But the next moment she added, I wonder, are they friendly? For she had just noticed on the outskirts of the crowd 1 or 2 giants and some people whom she couldn't give a name to at all. At that moment Aslan and the signs rushed back into her mind. She had forgotten all about them since the last hour. Scrub, she whispered, grabbing his arm. Scrub, quick! Do you see anyone you know? So you've turned up again, have you? Said Scrub disagreeably, for which he had some reason. Oh, keep quiet, can't you? I want to listen. Don't be a fool, said Jill. There isn't a moment to lose. Don't you see some old friend here? Because you've got to go and speak to him at once. What are you talking about? Said Scrub. It's Aslan, the lion. He says you've got to, said Joel despairingly. I've seen him. Oh, you have you? What did he say? He said the very first person you saw in Narnia would be an old friend, and you've got to speak to him at once. Well, there's nobody out here I've ever seen in my life before, and anyway, I don't know whether this is Narnia. I thought you said you've been here before, said Jill. Well, you thought wrong then. Well, I like that. You told me. For heaven's sake, dry up and let's hear what they're saying. The king was speaking to the dwarf, but Jill couldn't hear what he said. And, as far as she could make out, the dwarf made no answer, though he nodded and wagged his head a great deal. Then the king raised his voice and addressed the whole court, but his voice was so old and cracked that she could understand very little of his speech, especially since it was all about people and places she had never heard of. When the speech was over, The king had stooped down and kissed the dwarf on both cheeks, straightened himself, raised his right hand as if in blessing, and went, slowly with feeble steps, up the gangway and up aboard the ship. The courtiers appeared to be greatly moved by his departure. Handkerchiefs were got out, sounds of sobbing were heard in every direction. The gangway was cast off, trumpets sounded from the poop, and the ship moved away from the quay. It was being towered by a rowing boat, but Joel didn't see that. Now, said Scrub, but he didn't get any farther, because at that moment a large white object, Joel thought for a second that it was a kite, came gliding through the air and alighted at its feet. It was a white owl, but so big that it stood as high as a good-sized dwarf. It blinked and peered as if it was short sight, put his head on one side, and said in a soft hooting kind of voice, "Toot-woo, toot-woo, who are you two?" "My name is Scrub, and this is Paul," said Eustace. "Would you mind telling us where we are?" "In the land of Narnia, at the king's castle of Che Paravel." "Is that the king who's just taken ship?" "Too true," said the owl sadly, shaking his big head. "But who are you? There's something magic about you two. I saw you arrive. You flew. Everyone else was so busy seeing the king take off that nobody knew. Except me. I happened to notice you. You flew." "We were sent here by Aslan," said Eustace in a low voice. Toot-woo, said the owl, ruffling out its feathers. "This is almost too much for me. So early in the evening. I'm not quite myself till the sun is down." "And we've been sent to find the lost prince," said Joel, who had been anxiously waiting to get in the conversation. "It's the first I've heard about that," said Eustace. "What prince?" "You had better come and speak to the Lord Regent at once," it said. "That's him, over there in the donkey cart. It's Tumpkin the dwarf." The bird turned and began leading the way, muttering to itself, "Woo, toot-woo, what to do? I can't think clearly yet. It's too early." What is the king's name?" asked Eustace. "Caspian the 10th, said the owl, and Jill wondered why Scrub had suddenly pulled up short in his walk and turned an extraordinary colour. She thought that he had never seen him look so sick about anything. But before she had time to ask any questions, they had reached the dwarf, who was just gathering up the reins of his donkey and preparing to drive back to the castle. The crowd of courtiers had broken up, and they were going in the same direction, by ones and twos and little knots, like people coming away from watching a game or race. "Toot-woo, ahem, Lord Regent," said the owl, stooping down a little and holding its beak near the dwarf's ear. "Heh, what's that?" said the dwarf. "Two strangers, my lord," said the owl. "Rangers? What d'ye mean?" said the dwarf. "I see two uncommonly grub canmubs. What do they want?" "My name's Jill," said Jill, pressing forward. She was very eager to explain the important business on which they had come. "The girl's called Jill," said the owl, as loud as it could. "What's that?" said the dwarf. "The girls are killed. I don't believe a word of it. What girls? Who killed them?" "Only one girl, my lord," said the owl. "Her name is Jill." Speak up, said the dwarf. "Don't stand there buzzing and twittering in my ear. Who's been killed?" "Nobody's been killed," hooted the owl. "Who?" "Nobody." All right, you needn't shout. I'm not so deaf as all that. What do you mean by coming here to tell me that nobody's been killed? Why should anyone have been killed?" "Better tell him I'm Eustace," said Scrub. "The boy's Eustace, my lord," hooted the owl as loud as it could. "Useless?" said the dwarf irritably. "I dare say he is. Is that any reason for bringing him to court, hey?" "Not useless," said the owl. "Eustace." "Used to it, is he?" "I don't know what you're talking about, I'm sure. I tell you what it is, Master Gloomfeather. When I was a young dwarf, there used to be talking beasts and birds in this country who really could talk. There wasn't all this mumbling and muttering and whispering. It wouldn't have been tolerated for a moment. Not for a moment. Sir Ernest, my trumpet, please." A little fawn who had been standing quietly beside the dwarf's elbow all this time now handed him a silver ear trumpet. It was made like the musical instrument called a serpent, so that the tube curled right around the dwarf's neck. While he was getting it settled, the owl Gilmfeather suddenly said to the children in a whisper, "My brain's a bit clearer now. Don't say anything about the lost prince. I'll explain it later. It wouldn't do. Toot-woo? What are to do? Now, said the dwarf, if you have anything sensible to say, Master Gilmfeather, try and say it. Take a deep breath, and don't attempt to speak too loudly. With help from the children, and in spite of a fit of coughing on the part of the dwarf, Gilmfeather explained that the strangers had been sent by Aslan to visit the court of Narnia. The dwarf glanced up quickly at them with a new expression in his eyes. Sent by Lion himself, hey? He said. And from, that other place, beyond the world's end, eh? Yes, my lord, bawled Eustace into the trumpet. Son of Adam and daughter of Eve, hey? Said the dwarf. But the people at Experiment House haven't heard of Adam and Eve, so Joel and Eustace couldn't answer this. But the dwarf didn't seem to notice. Well, my dears, he said, taking the first one and then the other one by the hand and bowing his head a little, you are very heartily welcome. If the king, my poor master, had not this very hour set sail for the 7 Isles, he would have been glad for your coming. It would have brought back his youth to him for a moment. And now it is high time for supper. You shall tell me your business in full council tomorrow morning. Master Gilmfeather, see that the bedchambers and suitable clothes and all else are provided for these guests in your most honourable fashion. And Gilmfeather, in your ear,